All right, well, we may as well kick off. People can join later anyhow. The opening slides are pretty easy to get through anyhow. So for those who don't know me, my name is Nick Randolph. I run a consulting company called Built to Roam, and predominantly we're actually doing a bunch of Uno platform stuff. So it's currently the thing that we're doing at the moment. So I thought I'd come down and give you a bit of an overview of it. I'm on Twitter if you want to get hold of me. Otherwise, the usual things like email and stuff like that all work as well. Firstly, how many people here have built mobile apps of some variety on any platform before? Okay, a few people. And the others, are you interested in building mobile or are you interested in desktop, web? Desktop? And what tech are you using for desktop at the moment? Woohoo! Okay, so there's some really good news coming down that part. So the Uno team are working on something that Microsoft has talked about but haven't delivered on, which is around XAML islands and being able to embed stuff into existing apps. And trying to migrate WPF into sort of future technologies is hard because quite often they're big projects, multi-year projects, and that kind of code base isn't going to migrate over time. Well, it can migrate over time, but it's not going to be a cut and run type thing for the newer platforms. So Uno Islands or XAML Islands or whatever they're going to call it is something that the team's been working on to try and get it to the point where you can start embedding Uno components. It won't be XAML Islands in the true sense of using the WinUI platform. That's obviously something Microsoft could be working on and have talked about. When they'll ship that, I don't know. It'll actually be using, I think, the Skia backend to actually allow you to embed Uno components in it. So we can talk about that a little bit afterwards as well. Okay, so let's get into it. The problem domain that we're really working in is this ability to build cross-platform applications. So we're typically talking, or in the past we've talked about iOS and Android as being the two major platforms. We're talking about cross-platform, but as you'd see if you're looking at Flutter or .NET MAUI or any of those cross-platform libraries, it's now a matter of building for mobile, desktop, and web. Okay, and so the good platforms out there will be targeting all of those. And that brings with it a bunch of problems because, if you're trying to do cross-platform development and build the same thing over and over again, that's a huge cost, okay? A lot of the big companies like the banks and stuff like that do have dedicated teams for building for iOS and for Android and stuff because they want that premium experience. And in the past, there hasn't been good frameworks for building, native applications across them. The second problem is that, as we've just talked about, there's a whole bunch of existing, predominantly desktop applications out there that are on sort of like older code bases. And hopefully with the new sort of .NET framework versions and stuff like that, we've been able to move some of those forward to .NET 5 and .NET 6, but trying to get those across to the other platforms is actually problematic. And often results in developers having to build subsections of those apps for those particular platforms. And then the last one is really around skills, because if you're then having to build for all of these platforms, you're having to maintain a team that's got skills in all of those and provide, not just the basic training for them, but then a sort of a path forward for those. And if you can provide a common platform that they're all working to, and maybe hire or bring in contractors who know specific subsets of those platforms. For example, if you want to do notifications on iOS, you might bring a contractor in just to help out with that particular part of it. But you don't need to maintain a full-time, dev resource just so that you can support those platforms. And so the idea behind the Uno platform is to address all three of these concerns onto a single platform. And so unlike the approach taken by the MAUI or the Xamarin Forms team that's really provided an abstraction layer across all of these platforms, the Uno platform says, okay, well, Microsoft's delivered a really good platform in UWP/WinUI now that we can then take that and use that as the template for the other platforms. Or use it as the interface for the other platforms. And so underneath, they then it's an abstraction layer, and then underneath that, they're then rendering to native controls on the individual platforms. So they see that as the base level, and then obviously .NET, C# and XAML is what we treat as the platform that sits above that. That core bit of technology has been around for a while now, and it's to the point where the team are now focusing on building productivity stuff on top of there. So in this diagram, you see the sort of the top level concerns around themes, extensions, toolkits, tools, and Figma. Those are all of the stuff that the team are now actively working on to build productivity. Right? So that core section at the bottom is, I'd never say it's done, because obviously there's iterations on the platform, there's new features that iOS, Windows, Android, web, they're all coming out with new things. Like the latest one, coming out of Microsoft is .NET 7, right? So we're now having to upgrade the core to support .NET 7, and that's specifically relevant to WASM, okay? Because that's a very, very new space, and it's undergoing a lot of change, particularly in the .NET support for WASM. So that's the core that they focus on. But above that, they're really interested in making sure that developers are productive on the platform. And so we'll touch base on some of those platform enhancements towards the end of the session. To give you a bit of an idea of the sort of the marketplace of cross-platform apps, these are some of the other competitors or the other options in the cross-platform space. So if we go around the loop here, we've got Avalonia, we've got Flutter, we've got React Native, and we've got Xamarin Forms / Maui. And so those ones kind of fall into these two broader buckets of basically those that support native controls or use the native controls as the underlying rendering technology. So on the right-hand side, you see those with React Native and Xamarin Forms and Maui. So they're basically taking those underlying controls and actually using those to display the content of your application. And then on the left, we're seeing technologies like Avalonia and Flutter that really treat the device as a canvas. And they said, okay, we're going to ignore all the platform level controls. We're going to basically render every single pixel on a blank canvas. And there's a lot of merits in that approach. And we're seeing that in some platforms, Uno are having to do that. So for example, if we want to support WPF, and build stuff for Win7, which is still supported out there by a number of enterprises, that does actually use a blank canvas. It basically uses a Skia rendering engine to actually deliver a pixel-perfect solution. The other aspect that is interesting to look at is this concept of control templating. And for those familiar with XAML, one of the benefits of XAML is that you can restyle things, and you have this idea of lookless controls. So the idea is that the behavior or the functionality of the controls is separate from the way that it renders. And so you should be able to take a control, completely restyle it, and it's still having the same underlying functionality. And so that's one of the areas that I think, that if you look at these technologies, Avalonia does that well, because obviously it's kind of come out of the WPF space, which already existed, supported that. And then Uno supports that as well. Okay, so essentially we've got a basic bit of XAML here, and we'll actually see this running in a second. But the idea is that we're taking that XAML and we're getting exactly the same rendering across all of the different platforms that are currently supported. And so we've got here everything from web all the way through to Linux and macOS, Windows, iOS, and Android. Okay, enough slides for 2 seconds. Let's go and actually write some code. Right, so we're going to generate a new app. I'm actually going to drive this from command line in terms of new app one. There are Visual Studio templates, so if you're in Visual Studio, we can go new Uno app and generate it that way. But for the time being, we're going to run this, and it's going to generate us a new solution. You will notice I put the --VS Code at the end, and really all that does is basically adds the launch commands for running the application within VS Code. It's nothing specific to the solution structure or anything like that, but it just saves me having to go and define what the launch.json file is. Now, there's a couple of things. For those who have worked with VS Code, there's obviously C# extensions, but there is actually on Uno platform extensions that you should grab as well. Now, I'm just going to give it a couple of seconds. What we should see is that it's going to prompt me in a little bit to restore this project, and then we'll hit go on that. There we go. And then down here, we can pick what project we're going to deploy. So for the time being, I'm actually going to push out the WASM project. We'll give it a second to finish restoring. And actually, just because I'm running this on this laptop, which is a little bit slower than usual, I'm actually going to change this timeout to 60 seconds. And we'll give that a run. So we see that it launches the browser. And behind the scenes, if we actually take a look in the debug console, you'll see that it's actually running .NET Run. And so give it a minute or two, and we should actually see that it's spitting out a URL that it's listing on. Hopefully it does it within my 60 seconds before the debug experience times out. I'll give it a second. It does get there. Okay, so there you can see that it's pushing out that. And what we should see in the UI is that that's now updating, and actually it's showing the application in a second. So this is WebAssembly, so you'll notice that there is a little bit of a delay while it downloads the actual WebAssembly components and actually runs them. So this is my Hello World app. The really nice thing about VS Code is if I come in here and just to my code behind, I can come down here, basically set a breakpoint in here, and if I refresh this, it will actually hit that breakpoint. Give it a second. And particularly for WASM, the debug experience actually is quite good in here. So you can actually hover over there, you'll get sort of drill down into the environment variables. You can obviously step through your code like that, like you'd expect for a debugger experience. So let me just let that run. The other thing we're going to do is come to our main page, and let's just write some different XAML in here. Let's put a slider in there. So that's going to be our slider, and then we'll data bind that to our text block. Now, hopefully if the demo gods are with me, we should have a slider. I should be able to do that. Right. So VS Code is really good for doing particularly the WASM development. If you're doing the other platform development, I would highly recommend using Visual Studio as the sort of the debugging experience is a premium offering there. Okay, let's just whiz back to the slides for a second. Okay, as I mentioned, the Uno platform has been around for a while. The inception of this was really from Inventive, that was doing a lot of consulting around predominantly the phone platform, but then looking at what they could do on other platforms. And so this idea of basically taking what Microsoft had done around UWP and saying, okay, well, what happens if we could actually deliver on that truly universal story and actually having it run everywhere? And so that was the inception. It went open source in 2018, along with the very, very first support for WebAssembly. And since there's been sort of this gradual progression of sort of 6 to 8 kind of releases a year to support various things, right? So you can see along the way they've added in macOS support, Net 5 support, Net 6 support as we get into the 4.0 timeframe, and most recently the Net 6 mobile support. So for those who've been tracking what the Microsoft team has been doing around .NET MAUI, that's actually very closely linked to what they're doing under the underlying platform to bring .NET 6 to the Xamarin platform, so iOS, Android, Mac Catalyst, etc. So there's been a bit of turbulence there, both in terms of Visual Studio support, which is in preview, along with the actual MAUI framework, which is actually the high-level components that sits on .NET for Android, .NET for iOS, as it's now referred to. So the old terminology around sort of Xamarin platforms has kind of gone away. So typically, if you're talking about Xamarin, you're now talking about pre-Net 6 support. The Uno platform in 4.3 provided that support for .NET 6 mobile, and that's an ongoing thing to build on as we go into the sort of the Net 6 and Net 7 timeframes. Okay, in terms of licensing, it is entirely open source. We were just chatting beforehand about the fact that all of the Uno development is done in the open, right? So it doesn't matter whether you're looking at the core Uno platform, the extensions, which is one of the projects that I'm working on, the toolkit, it's all done in the open, right? So if you ever want to raise an issue, go to the particular GitHub repo and raise an issue. The other thing about that is, there is this support contract at the bottom, right? So if you're an enterprise and you're looking for, an SLA and that type of thing, they do provide a paid support model, which is actually interesting because even Microsoft for .NET MAUI don't really offer that. I mean, you can get some form of support out of Microsoft using their consulting services and stuff like that, but it's not a true enterprise support in the sense of being able to access the team and getting good feedback there. But beyond that, one of the things I would say about it is if you ever run across a blocker or an issue that's really breaking you in terms of support for Uno, raise it as an issue because the team are very cognizant of when a developer is broken, because if one developer is broken, chances are there are other developers who just haven't said anything. And so they're very conscious about making sure that those fixes get prioritized over feature development, etc. Interestingly enough, Microsoft is the biggest open source contributor by virtue of them building WinUI. So for those who don't know the history there, essentially Microsoft's done multiple iterations of the XAML platform, starting from the Silverlight days, WPF, WinPhone, Win8, which then merged into UWP. UWP was very tightly linked to the platform, so every time Windows versioned, essentially you're versioning the UWP platform, and the two were kind of in sync. So if you wanted new features, you had to wait for a new platform version. WinUI is basically Microsoft's attempt at trying to take that and remove it from that. It's still dependent on Windows, obviously, but it's basically separating it from the OS version. And as part of doing that, Uno is now reliant on WinUI, and so you can then take that and apply it to the other platforms. just by way of an example, the benefits that we get from being or having Microsoft as that contributor is that we can essentially reuse the underlying code that's available for these controls, right? So rather than the Uno team having to completely rewrite things, they can actually leverage the actual source code. And that makes sure that we're not just rendering stuff correctly, we're actually, the behavior is exactly the same across the platforms. It also means that other libraries can be brought across, right? So basically any net standard library can come across. Now there's some caveats there, because if it's net standard that does some funky things for iOS and Android, it doesn't always come across, because then you're doing some UI stuff but calling it a net standard library. So there are some little workarounds that you have to do that. I will also say that in the Net 6 timeframe, some of the changes that Microsoft have rolled out around the mobile support has caused third-party libraries to break, and not just break for Uno team, but break for everyone doing mobile development in the sort of the Microsoft ecosystem. Third-party control libraries, we do have some vendors there that are actually producing Uno-compatible versions. So they're taking their libraries that work for Windows and making sure that they work for Uno. And then there's some presentation layers that sit on top of that, so Reactive UI and Prism. Example of one of those is basically the infragistics control for the Uno platform. And sort of now we get into so that was the core platform stuff, and now we sort of get into the productivity tools. And by this we're talking, okay, how do we streamline the process for developers to actually build stuff in terms of, okay, what tooling do they need? In terms of, are they working in VS Code? Do we want hot reload? Those types of things. What can we do in terms of UI controls? And so remembering that WinUI is predominantly a desktop framework, and so when you're looking at mobile apps, there'll be things like the navigation bar and drawers that come up from the bottom on various platforms. Those components don't exist in the WinUI that Microsoft is shipping, and so there's an opportunity there for the Uno platform to build out a number of these sort of controls that belong in this toolkit to make it easier for application developers to get started. And building them in a way that it's not going to just be for mobile, but build it in a way that it will work on desktop and actually make sense on desktop as well. And then the last part of there is, and we'll actually touch on this first, is actually the Figma support, because one of the biggest problems with building apps is trying to get the designs that your designers are coming up with and actually rendering them somehow on a mobile device. And there's a bunch of problems associated with that, because designers love to live in the tools that they work with, right? So whether it be Figma or Sketch, etc. And there's typically this big handoff problem where they say, hey, here's my Figma file. And developers go, that's great, I've got no idea how I'm going to take that and make it render in this app. And so what's interesting there is that the Figma support that the Uno team is working on actually mirrors what Microsoft are doing around the Power App space, and the Figma support that they're doing to try and build, or try and engage designers around the support for building Power Apps. So typically the other end of the problem is that we have these very opinionated frameworks where you can go and you've got a 4GL to basically create what your app's going to look like, but it somewhat limits the designers as to how flexible things are going to be in terms of the design elements that are supported. And it's typically fairly rigid from a development perspective. So if you think about Power Apps, in terms of the app capabilities, you're actually kind of very limited to the components that it ships. Yes, there is an extension model where you can build custom components, but then you're then responsible for building the entire web component and shipping it. Hopefully, the support that Uno bring to this kind of fits in this middle ground. They're not promising to deliver end-to-end app experience. They're promising to try and deliver an experience where designers can go and build their app, or design what the app's going to look like, and for us to basically generate the XAML, generate the layout for our applications. And hopefully in the demo you'll see that comes to fruition. So there are two parts to the Uno platform for Figma. There's essentially a component library. The idea here is that if you're building on the material design language or the Cupertino design language, you can basically take this component library in Figma, use the various components to build up your application, and then we should be able to use the plugin to actually generate the XAML that's going to run in your application. And the generated XAML should support things like, okay, well, what does navigation look like? Is that, when I click on a button, where should I be able to navigate to? And it should deal with things like localization and accessibility, all of those sort of common platform problems. So there's a short video here that sort of just walks through what that experience kind of looks like. We'll just let that play for a couple of seconds, and you can see that it's a fairly extensive component library, as much as you can see in that video. So how about we actually just drop into Figma and have a look. So we're going to take a look at this sample app in Figma. How many people have used Figma before? Yeah, it was a bit of a lost art for me as well. I hadn't touched it in years, and it's like the team has sort of reintroduced me to it. And you know, what's amazing that they've been working on is that. Okay, so let's just drop into here and have a look and get started. So this template, which you can actually get from the Uno platform Figma site, is actually quite comprehensive. So it's got a bunch of sort of instructions on how to use the template. And then it's broken down based on a number of the sort of the design aspects that people have to consider. So things like theming, so you can see here all of the color palettes, the typography, there's ones for icons and things like that. Then we have a bunch of the standard components. And not just, okay, here's what our button looks, but here's what our button looks like with every variant of the color palette that you kind of got. And so when you're building up your app, rather than having to redesign the button every single time, you can come here and you can grab, okay, I want the outlined focus states, right? So I'm going to grab the button and just drag it onto my design. And so the idea there is that you can then build up a sample app, well, in this case, a real app, based on those components. And so the idea there is that we can then start to generate XAML because they're sort of well-known components. So let me actually show you this page that I've got focus. We'll launch the plugin. It takes a second or two. Now, what's really interesting is actually the technical aspects of this. So this is actually running it's an Uno app running in a web container, so it's running WebAssembly, which is why it took a second or so to load. And what's really interesting is this page here is the generated XAML for the component that we have selected. In this case, it's the search products page. And if I go to the play layout here, this is taking that XAML, compiling it, or at least parsing it, and actually rendering it using components in WebAssembly. Right, so that's it's a bit like Inception. It's kind of like an Uno app inside an Uno app inside Figma. But like literally, this is running code, and actually, this is the data source that you're actually seeing being generated for what's actually being showed there. So you could actually go and change the data source, and it would actually update the app. So we're going to actually take that XAML, and we're actually going to load it into a real app in a second. So let me just go back to the slides. So that's a very quick overview of the Figma plugin. The other aspect that they've got good support for is around themes. So remember I was saying that one of the aspects of Uno is this idea of lookless controls and stylable controls. So the idea here is that, okay, out of the box, WinUI comes with this thing called Fluent Styles, which is Microsoft styling for everything. Most people who are building iOS and Android apps kind of default to either Material UI or Cupertino. So the idea here is that this themes library allows you to basically pick which of those themes you actually want to use for your application. And so you can switch basically just by importing a different theme library between a UI that looks like Fluent, UI that looks like Material, and even Material Design 2 and 3, because they've changed slightly recently, and then Cupertino. So you can literally just import different libraries or different resources to switch between those, right? No code change elsewhere in your app. It's not like you have to use different components or different controls. You can basically change the style and it reflects in your app. Okay, so these are some of the toolkit controls that I mentioned before. So we've got things like a nav bar and a tab bar at the bottom, a drawer that pops up from the bottom, an auto layout control that basically means that you can just place elements on in a list in XAML, and that they automatically work out how they're going to be sized. And then we move on to the extensions, and this is the sort of the project that's close to my heart at the moment because I'm kind of working on it. And the idea here is very similar to what Microsoft have attempted to do with the Microsoft extensions. So these are to support things like dependency injection, make it easy to do things like logging, and the ones that are not there is navigation. And so quite often, if we look at navigation, it's always taken from a UI, very UI-centric concept, right? So typically we have a frame, and then we're going to navigate on the frame, so we do pages, and that's the end of navigation in terms of the framework support that we get from the platform. But navigation's a bunch more complicated than that because, for example, if I've got a set of tabs, navigation really kicks in when we start to switch between those tabs. And then, in one of those tabs, I might click on a button to go to a next page. And it's like, okay, well, that's great. But now when I expand out my app to be a full screen app, I don't want tab bars on the bottom. I might want a nav view. And so when I click on that item, instead of it being, a frame-based navigation, so going to a new page, I actually want the details of what I've just clicked on to appear alongside. So all of those sort of concepts around responsive navigation and things like that are stuff that we're trying to deliver as part of this extensions framework. And the last one is around reactive extensions for Uno. And so one of the common problems that we have when we're building apps is that the notion of data binding is really simple, okay? And it's very easy for us to spin up a UI, spin up a view model that's going to be data bound to the UI, and expose a bunch of properties that are going to change and reflect in the UI. And we kind of think of the view model as being the state of our UI. But as the complexity of our app increases and we start to have a bunch of services and managers and things like that that are driving change in the background, one of the problems that we often face is having to work out how we're going to be publishing updates back to the UI to get it to refresh properly. And so quite often, this is one of the complaints about XAML is that it's not sort of MVU in terms of it's not this new model where updates go down the pipe and then we get state change coming back up. We get immutable data or an immutable state coming back up. And so what we're trying to do with the reactive extensions is to provide a model where you can still use data binding, except your view model now exposes a state or a feed of states. And the challenge there is normally that trying to do data binding between a feed or an observable is actually quite problematic because none of the UI controls are designed to support that. And so the reactive extensions is designed to generate a bunch of boilerplate code that actually does that glue between the two based on our view model. Okay, and the last part is the tooling, and we did see some of this when I had the demo up for VS Code. So let's actually switch back to my command line, and we're going to generate another app here. So let's go .NET new, and we're going to use the one of the extensions templates. And I'm actually going to open it in code just because I need to make a very quick change to the one of the imports that we do. So you'll see here that these are basically all of the extensions libraries that are referenced by default. I'm actually going to add a couple in there to do with refit because I want to basically be able to import an endpoint without having to write a bunch of code. You also notice that I've imported the community toolkit. So this gives us some boilerplate code for doing basically an implementation of iNotify property change and some neat code generators that we'll see in a second. So I'm going to save that, close that, come back to my command line, and I'm just going to go .ndc, and launch Visual Studio. Now, what you'll notice is that there's actually quite a dramatic difference between the solution that gets generated for the extensions and the one that we saw before. The one that we generated in the first demo basically had a bunch of projects for each of the target heads, so iOS, Android, MacOS, etc. And then it had one shared project that basically had all of the code that was going to be shared between our various target projects. What we'll see here is that this is designed closer to what you'd expect in a proper app, like a real app that sort of separates your UI from your business layer. So it's got basically all of the different platforms. You'll notice that iOS and Android and macOS have all been condensed into the mobile project. And that's one of the changes that's come as part of the migration to Net 6, is that Microsoft have got this sort of single project format to support iOS, Android, Mac. It will eventually support Windows, so these two towards the bottom there, the Windows Desktop and Package, will actually be merged into that mobile project, although they're not technically mobile, so we'll probably rename that. But the idea is that you have this one single project that can handle all of those. what I'm going to actually do is actually select all of those, and I'm actually going to unload them. The reason being is that Visual Studio is inherently bad in terms of these different targets, because it tries to restore each one of them independently, and it just ends up being quite slow to actually work with. So I typically unload the platforms that I'm not immediately targeting, and then reload them when I actually want to debug and test out on those. We're going to set the Windows one as the startup project and kick that off. But then the other projects that we've got there are a unit testing project. Okay, so you can write tests for your business logic, which is all in this class library down here. And then we can write UI tests. And so one of the nice things we've got here is the ability to run up the Uno application, and the easiest target to use is actually the web one. So you can run up your WebAssembly app, and the unit test can basically kick through and step through and validate, and do things like screenshot before and after and confirm that they're the same, etc. So it's actually a really good platform to work with in terms of UI tests. And then the last project we saw there that was in the solution structure here is where all of our views and pages are going to be. Okay. So the default application we get is very basic. It does have a couple of little things. So firstly, you'll see that it's actually picked up some of this material design. Okay, so we've actually set that as the default because we recognize that a lot of app developers are using material as the standard. If you don't like that, you can easily change it. As I mentioned before, you can basically replace that with either Cupertino or Fluent. We'll see that we've actually got a nav bar at the top, but because this is the first page, there's no sort of back button or anything like that. If I go to the second page, you'll see that there's a back button that's automatically added there to take me back to the home page. Okay, so let's actually restyle this a little bit and actually put in the XAML that came out of our Figma file. So let's switch back to here. I'm going to copy this. So this is the XAML for our page. And we're going to drop it into, not here, let me just go to here, into our main page. Okay, we're going to place the XAML, and we're going to replace it with there. All right. So the default XAML that gets generated, there's a couple of things I'm going to make changes to. Firstly, our list view is currently bound to a thing called items. I'm going to change that to a list of products. I'm then going to fix this build issue by adding an import. And I know that there is a slight bug in the XAML that's generated there, so I'll fix that as well. So that's basically the XAML done, and hopefully what we should see when we run the app is something that's going to look like that. But currently we're not loading any products, and so we basically need to add some code to do that. And for that, I'm actually going to use, there's an endpoint called dummyjson.com that I came across the other day. It's really great because basically you just call it and it returns basically a dummy set of products. And it's great for sort of prototyping up applications, particularly in that kind of space. So we're going to take that and I'm just going to grab the code from here. And so here's my POCO objects that are I'm going to use to basically import that into our application. I'm going to come across here to our main view model. Normally I would throw this into a separate file, but for the time being I'm just going to put it in the bottom of here. Put my namespaces at the top. Okay, so that should give us our dummy endpoint that we can then call. So I'm going to add that as a dependency into my main view model. I'll call it endpoint. And we're going to write a couple of methods to basically retrieve the data. Generate a method stub, call that async task. Ooh, better await that, otherwise we're not going to get a result. Now, you might think I'm setting that to an object that doesn't exist, and you'd be quite right. The reason for that is I know that I'm about to do this. Or object. Okay, so this observable object is coming from the community toolkit. I'm misspelling it, so let's actually correct that. And one of the things you need to do if you're using the MVM toolkit is to make sure that your view models are partial, because it's going to code generate the other half of it. Okay, so essentially this observable object will go and generate the iNotify property change implementation for your class. And so what we're going to do is create a products property, but we're going to use observable property for that. So I'm going to declare a backing variable, so private product, called product. So notice that that's lowercase, whereas the property that I'm actually setting is actually uppercase. And what that will do is it's actually going to call the generated codes that will trigger the iNotify property change, and we'll use to update the UI when actually the data comes back. So that's all we need from the view model perspective. There are a couple of configuration things that I need to do. So the first one is I basically need to say, okay, I want to use refit to basically to load this data. So I'm going to come, for those who have worked with the Microsoft extensions, or even if you've done sort of ASP.NET style code, you'll be familiar with this kind of configurator or host builder kind of pattern. And so we've got this within our app. And if you're doing MAUI stuff, they've got a very similar pattern to that as well. So we're just going to import these things like that. And so that's the configuration part. The very last thing we need to do to get this to work is actually tell it what URL we're going to be calling, because so far we haven't declared that anywhere. And that's done via our app settings file. So we can basically drop this into here. And if the demo gods are with me, what we should see is a list of products. Now, these are not going to be super awesome products. They're basically just going to be a list of products that come from that dummy JSON endpoint. And so there's nothing that's specific in that code to the Windows platform, right? So yes, I'm showing it running on Windows, but you can essentially run this on any of the target platforms that are supported. D-time, is it going to work? Whey! Okay, now the one thing that is a bit naff is that when I click on these, nothing happens, okay? So you think how we started, we had 2 pages, I clicked on the button and it went to the second page, so I know that I've got 2 pages there. Why don't we make use of that and show you a little bit about navigation using the extensions. So to do that, I'm going to come down here onto my list view, right? So I'm going to do navigation, and I'm saying, okay, well, where do I want it to go to? And so I'm going to specify what the request is. Now, what I'm doing essentially here is I'm defining the route that I want it to go when I'm clicking on any of the items in there, which is great. And the support there, by defining what the request is going to be, behind the scenes, we're doing things like attaching to the selection changes event. We're going to extract what the currently selected item is, and we're going to pass that along with the navigation to our second page. Now, you might be going second, but hang on, your page is called second page, your view model is called second view model. Where is this second coming from? And whilst we could rely on some sort of, conventions for doing that, so we could say, okay, well, we're going to take the second view model, strip the view model apart, and let's call it second. Behind the scenes, we can do that. However, we've actually got a mechanism here where we can override that, so we can define what these routes are going to be. And I've got to come in here because one of the things about passing data between them is I need to say what type of data is going to be passed between those so that they get injected correctly. So I'm going to say this is a data view model or data view map, and I'm going to say pass the product across as part of it. I then need to update my second view model to basically say, when you get newed up, so in the constructor, you need to take a product as a parameter. Now, I'm actually going to do that. I'm actually going to make this immutable. I'm actually going to make it a record, and I'm going to say take in a product, and we'll call it product as well. And that's my view model. Okay, so increasingly what we're seeing with the apps that we're building is that we're moving away from having our view models as a class, making them records, and so we get a bunch of inputs as part of the constructor, but that's it. We might have methods and things like that, but we're not really changing the state of our view model anymore. Okay, so that's the view model part done. The last thing we need to do is come to our second page and actually show what item we got selected. So I'm just going to use a text block. I'll do some data binding to our product.name. And let's just bump this font size up a little bit so we can see it. We'll put it in the middle of the screen. And let's run our application, and hopefully we should be able to navigate between the two and actually show the product details. So you just got to imagine in your brain that this is a really slick product details page. And look, if I wanted to spend more time, I could copy the XAML out of the Figma file, put it in here, and then bind it up that way. Think of it as an immutable class. So it's So typically if you're passing a data object around, quite often you're not wanting to make changes to it, or if you are, you'll want to do it in a mutable way, so it's generating a new instance every time you change it. And so that's the concept of a record, basically. It is behind the scene, it is a class, but all of your properties are basically defined as get with an init instead of a setter. And so the idea there is that you can use, product, and if you want to change it, you can do product with name equals blah, and that will generate a new instance of your product object with the name that's been updated. So, all right, woohoo. Okay, so that's basic navigation in there. And you notice that I haven't had to write any navigation code. You still can, so we do have like support for writing, navigation code in your view model or navigation code in the code behind, but it's all using a very consistent metaphor of using these routes to get to different places in your app. There's a whole bunch of sections we can talk about in terms of navigation support. Right, so the other thing I wanted to show and see whether this is going to work is I'm actually going to reload the mobile target, and this is kind of ambitious. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I'm actually going to load the Windows subsystem for Android, because one of the neat things you can now do if you're building for Android is actually, rather than having to spin up an emulator or attach to a real device, you can actually use the Windows subsystem for Android. So essentially you can have your Android app running on Windows for all intents and purposes. So let me go to the developer prompt. Okay, so that's there. Let's go ADB connect. And so you'll see that the Android subsystem is basically is now running. You see we've got an IP address associated with it, and then we can do ADB connect with that the IP address, and in theory that should connect. And so the Microsoft tooling in Visual Studio should actually detect that that's now there. Let's actually set that to be the startup project. Local devices, subsystem for Windows. And we'll give it a minute to actually go through booting up and actually running that. Okay. Let's just flip, whilst that's doing that, we'll come back to that in a second. Whilst it's doing that, let's just whiz back to the slides for a second. Okay. Okay, just to end the slides, essentially there are a bunch of customers that are already using Uno platform. Some of the notable ones are, so TradeZero is a very consumer-oriented app, so basically mobile first, providing now support for web and desktop. For those who use NuGet all the time, hopefully it's probably all of us, if on the right-hand side of NuGet, you'll actually notice that there's the NuGet Package Explorer. If you go and load that, let's just do that. Let's see, let's go to NuGet. Let's just pick up one of the template projects. Let's go to these. You'll see on the right-hand side, you can open it with the NuGet Package Explorer. You click on that, and it actually takes you to NuGet.info, and it'll actually download and open the package in the browser. Okay, so this is all client-side, so what it's doing now is it's literally going to NuGet, pulling down the package, and then it's going to unzip it and actually extract it so that we can see the contents of it. So it's a really good way to actually validate what package, like what the contents is of the package. And so we internally use this to make sure we're shipping the right bits. And so you can browse through here, you can basically open files. So basically click on this and actually see the contents of the file all in the browser. So this is an Uno app shipped. It actually came from the work that was done for the Windows NuGet Package Explorer that's in the store, and it's now just running on the web. Okay, some other examples. This is a customer who's migrating a WPF app to the web, and so it's actually quite a massive WPF app, multi-year type of investment, and they're bringing it to the web along with sort of 3D rendering of objects, etc. And so they're taking advantage of all of the .NET capabilities that's now coming to via WebAssembly. And the Uno calculator. So this was actually the original Windows calculator code from the 90s that's actually been brought forward, runs on .NET, and now runs as an Uno application and runs everywhere. So it's a pretty amazing. If you think about where that technology's come from, it's definitely very old code that's now coming forward. Okay. So in summary, Windows UI is about building an ecosystem. It's about supporting platforms with a pixel-perfect rendering, but now it's also about building on top of that and actually delivering a platform that can be productive for designers and developers to commingle. Call to actions, try it out, go to platform.uno, talk to the team. They're very responsive, both on Discord, but also if you need to raise an issue, we have questions. Questions go Stack Overflow, any issues can go on GitHub, and the team will be responsive. Let's see if my app ended up running. It did not. Let's try that again. There we go. He says, well, it crashes. I'm not quite sure why it crashed. Anyway, you have to take my word for it. It works. Demos gods are failing at one point there. Interesting. I'm sure I did something wrong in the support there. Questions? Are we all going to go out and build our first Uno app today? No? You're going to go party instead? Questions about the platform capabilities, where it fits in the landscape, anything?
I see a lot of WPF customers that can move to something else. You have an experience migrating WPF applications to Uno?
Personally, myself, no. The team does. So that customer that we talked about, Kahlua, they're migrating a very substantial WPF app across. And so what I'd suggest there is that they've taken the approach that they're going to leave WPF behind and basically migrate forward to a platform that's going to support both Windows and then the mobile platforms and, of course, the web. I'm not sure that for large WPF apps that's going to make a bunch of sense, because I just don't think that kind of investment can be re-engineered overnight. And so that would typically be a multi-year project just to get it to run on Windows using a newer technology. What I mentioned at the beginning of the session is this thing where, which they are yet to brand because it hasn't been released yet, but it will be something like Uno Islands. And the idea there is that you can take a subset of your application, or just a new development perhaps, and then migrate it in a way that it'll actually be supported on web and the various platforms as well. So, for the WPF app, it will run as using the Skia backend and actually render within the app, and shouldn't look like a separate app or anything like that. But then you can take that same code and actually skin it up as a separate app for iOS and Android, or for the web as well. So.
That's similar to Maui, or similar to
So Maui's got some interesting pieces there, but nothing that really supports migration of WPF. And so and actually the Maui platform itself doesn't support web. What's there in terms of web support is actually coming the other way. So if you've got a Blazor app and you want to run it on mobile, you can essentially embed the Blazor app into a mobile app. And so they've got some interesting bit of kit there, and definitely we value the work that they've done around the platform support for .NET for mobile and the pieces there. Their approach to the platform as a whole in terms of XAML and the way that things are rendered is just different from the way the Uno platform works. So, yeah. All right. Well, thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Friday. And, yeah, thanks for coming to the session. So.